Welcome to the show, Brain Health Unchaining Your Pain, and I'm really excited to talk to my friend Terry McDougall. Welcome to the show.
Dr. Ruth, thanks for having me. I'm excited for our conversation today.
I know we connected via the other Dr. Phil, so here we are. And Terry's got an amazing story to share. She's also author of her book, Winning the Game of Work, Career Happiness and Success on Your Own Terms, which I can really relate to, by the way, based on my career experiences. But for those that don't know Terry, she's an executive and career coach and CEO of Terry McDougall Coaching. She helps high-achieving professionals remove obstacles that keep them stuck so that they can enjoy more success and satisfaction in their lives and careers. And before becoming a coach, Terry was a long-time corporate marketing executive where she led teams, developed strategies, and advised senior leaders to drive business results. And she's author of, as I said, Winning the Game of Work, Career Happiness and Success on Your Own Terms. And she's also the host of the Marketing Mambo podcast, which I'm really excited to dive into. So welcome.
Well, thanks, Ruth. Good to be here.
So I'm really curious to know, what is it that you are super passionate about in life right now?
I'm super passionate about helping people expand that sweet spot between their professional success and personal happiness. I encounter a lot of people who, you might look at them from the outside and say, oh, they look so successful. They've got a great job, great title, making a lot of money, nice vacations, etc. But they're paying an extremely high price for that, I call it quote unquote success, in terms of stress, burnout, anxiety, and sometimes even health and relationship problems. And it doesn't have to be that way.
No.
You can actually sort of be in the flow and have more impact at work so you can be successful without killing yourself, without being on that constant, grind of the hamster wheel.
And what is it that you think keeps people on that? And I know we're going to explore this more and go into your story, but what is it that keeps people on that hamster wheel, do you think, from your personal experience of the clients that you've been serving?
Well, it's always their beliefs about what it will take to be successful. And for many high achievers, which I would say the vast majority of people I work with are high achievers, they have a track record of high educational attainment, success at work, etc. For many high achievers, they've really focused on external validation, meaning that they've tuned into what other people expect of them. And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, obviously, when we're at work, we have to understand what our bosses expect, etc. But often they've been so hyper focused on what's the goal that somebody else has for me, that they lose touch with their own inner wisdom, and very often lose touch with what they even want on a conscious level. Now, subconsciously, they know what they want, and that's often what leads to the stress, to the burnout, to the anxiety, because they're almost having like a internal tug of war between this, intellectual manager that's telling them things like, you have to work 12 hours a day, or you've got to do this or that, and refuses to sort of step back and prioritize, and that inner part of themselves that, maybe the inner child part that's like, hey, I just want to have some fun. Right. I mean, I kind of look at it like, what's success if you really don't have the time and energy to enjoy it?
Do you know, I really resonate with that, because I think a lot of people, certainly in high achievers, can also use work to avoid having the internal dialogue because it's too difficult or too painful, or they use it as an escape mechanism for the problems they're experiencing in the other parts of their lives, like their relationships could be failing, and so they plow their energy into work because that's successful. So they don't want to be seen as failing, And so their solution is to keep demonstrating success in the workplace, when in actual fact, that's often what can be at the root cause of the failure
Yeah,
that
absolutely.
they're having from a relationship level.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for a lot of people who are, more intellectualizers, a lot of times it's not easy to access that emotional side. And I'll speak for myself. I mean, I had quite a bit of trauma growing up, moving around a lot. My parents divorced when I was young. And sometimes we have unprocessed emotion, and we want to avoid it. And like you said,
Yeah.
that if you can focus on, well, I'm achieving, I'm, going to grad school, or I'm moving up the corporate ladder, we can sort of justify not paying attention to that emotional side of things, but it does
Mm.
not go away.
No.
It's there, and it actually takes a lot of energy ultimately to avoid dealing with um, emotional pain, with emotional trauma. And nobody likes to go there, but it doesn't go away if you ignore it.
And actually, it gets worse because you amplify it. Because
Hmm.
what happens is because you're avoiding it, it's like a boiling pot. So it keeps bubbling away inside
Yes.
to the point where actually, your pressure pot, the steamer, has to let
Yeah.
out the steam.
Right.
And if you take the analogy of a steamer, sometimes the lid comes off and it
Right.
explodes
Makes a mess.
in a way
Yeah.
that's
Dangerous.
uncontrollable.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Um, yeah. And it takes a lot of energy to keep the lid on as well.
Yeah.
And any energy that we're spending on staying in survival mode, like avoiding or fighting or judging or feeling frustrated or angry or sad, th- that energy cannot be used for more productive activity.
Mm.
So a lot of times in coaching, it's funny because I'm not a therapist, I'm an executive coach, but I'm trained as a
Hmm.
coach. Um, and sometimes people will jokingly say, "Oh, I told my wife I'm talking to my work therapist today," because sometimes we end up talking about things that aren't about the project or about the boss or about that coworker. It really goes back to, you know, what's your belief around wanting to avoid what might be a difficult conversation? Because
Mm.
a lot of times it goes back to, oh, well, my dad was a yeller, or, my mother had extremely high expectations for me and I couldn't do anything, more than be perfect, or
Mm.
I'd hear about it.
Mm.
And, if we don't really pull those things that are deep in our subconscious up to the conscious level and process it, to start to, maybe replace those beliefs with something else, we will just unconsciously continue to play by that script. It's
Mm.
almost like if your operating system on your computer has a glitch in it,
It keeps
whatever.
having the glitch until you pay attention
Yes,
to
until you go in and you patch it, you like do the update on the operating system. Because otherwise, whatever you try to run on top of it, like maybe your operating system has the glitch, but you're trying to run Microsoft Word on top, and every time that you go to save, it
it falls over.
right, it shuts down your computer. It's because you haven't really fixed the underlying issue. And, in work, that might be like you're telling yourself, like, oh, I have to please everyone around me. I can never say no to anyone. I've seen this very frequently, where people are very accomplished, but when it comes to dealing with authorities within the business, so their boss or their boss's boss, that sometimes they shrink and they almost become a little bit childlike, so they don't show everything that they're capable of doing.
Yeah.
And that sometimes can come from maybe having a parent who is distant or judgmental, and so they sort of unconsciously project that onto authority figures around them, and so they don't really show up the way that they truly are, or what
Hmm.
they don't show up the way that they're capable of operating in front of these authority
Mm.
figures.
And sometimes people can find that they attract those people
Absolutely.
subconsciously because they're exhibiting a behavior where,
Hmm.
that kind of relationship,
Hmm.
is is formed, and without, like you say, taking the time to go into your operating system,
Mm-hmm.
understanding the software that's running in the background,
Yeah,
that's making you
absolutely.
exhibit these, you know, behaviors that isn't really you, or not the behaviors you want to be exhibiting,
Mm-hmm.
you are always going to be attracting these problems, or not always, but there is a risk that you could
Mm-hmm.
be attracting these problems. But I know it gets worse than that as well, because often people who are having these unconscious thoughts that are running in the background, they end up sabotaging as well their actual hardware,
Mm-hmm.
which is how their brain functions through the actions that they do. So they're adding a
Mm-hmm.
layer of dysfunction on their computer hardware, i.e. their brain
Mm-hmm.
hardware, and that becomes even less efficient because it can't
Yeah,
function properly from a hardware perspective,
sure.
on top of the software issues that they have. And a classic example is the self-sabotage with inappropriate food and drink,
Yep. Yep.
that or drugs and alcohol, as the other, smoking and
Sure.
things, that sabotages your hardware in your brain,
Mm-hmm.
and then
Mm-hmm.
you layer on top the software issues as well. I'd love to dive into your story, but before we do, what is optimal brain health mean for you personally in the context of your story?
Well, it means maintaining appropriate energy to do the things that are important to me in my life. I've
Mm,
had times, earlier in my life where I really did sort of, sink into a funk, maybe would feel overly anxious or overly, I wouldn't say depressed, but down, like have,
mm,
kind of heavy moods. And back then, I didn't really realize that I had control over that. I didn't,
mm,
I would just sort of allow myself to kind of get pulled along with those subconscious beliefs until, over time, I realized that if I changed the way I thought, that my moods would change. And so I take a lot more responsibility for that now, when I used to sort of feel like a little bit more at a hostage of
mm.
of those moods based on my own thoughts.
Yeah, and we don't get taught this, do we? I mean, I
No.
didn't learn this until I became a brain health coach myself.
Hmm.
How important listening to our thoughts, that in essence run our operating system, and thoughts drive our feelings, our emotions, and our emotions drive
Hmm.
our actions drive our connection to ourselves and to other people, and the whole environment or our surroundings really influence everything associated with how we show up and how we truly operate. And I love you mentioned that energy is so important from a brain health perspective. Rex Miller mentioned this in an earlier show, and it is fundamental for me personally as well, because we can put so much of our energy, as you said, into fighting emotions that we haven't addressed and trying to keep a lid
Hmm.
on,
Yeah.
and not leveraging the energy that we do have to embrace the emotions in a positive way. And I like to think of emotions like a wave. It takes a lot of energy to dive down and swim beneath the wave and avoid it. It's much more efficient when you use the wave and learn how to ride it, but you have to learn to ride it. So you have to learn when that wave, when that wave is coming. You have to know where it is in the context of the ocean of emotions.
Yeah.
So you have to know where it is, and how you can leverage its power to get you to where you want to go, and use it, because emotion is just a signal that is telling us that we need to do something, in order to dissipate some built up energy, whether that's emotional energy, physical energy, spiritual energy, or mental energy. But it's about that, using the energy to best effect. I'd love to dive into your story. Could you take me back to the time when your energy levels were really at their lowest point? And you can go back as far as you like.
Oh my gosh. You know, Well, I'll just briefly talk about sort of my origin story, if you will, and then I can take you to a part where my energy level was at its lowest part. So I was born to very, very young parents. My mother actually had to
Uh-huh.
drop out of high school to have me, and that was I was what caused them to have to get married back
Okay.
in the 1960s. But my dad got a job with the American Telephone and Telegraph Company, AT&T, and he was on this work crew that traveled all throughout the Southeast and the US, burying the long distance cables. And
Wow.
because they were working, it was basically, just a constant series of construction projects.
Hmm.
And some of those projects might be 2 weeks, some of them might be, 3 or 4 months. But
Mm.
I moved uh, 41 times by the time I was 11 years old.
Wow.
And most of those moves were before I started school, but still, there was constant upheaval and disruption. And even when I got into school, every year I went to a different school between kindergarten and fifth grade. And
Wow.
so there was just a lot of, you know, uh, disruption and so forth. And I think that there were some positive things that I learned during that time, how to be very self sufficient, how to size up situations quickly. But there were also some kind of self protective mechanisms that I learned. I mean, I think the flip side of being self sufficient is that I I wasn't really keen on, reaching out and making friends with other people because I kind
Mhm.
of knew on a certain level
You
that,
couldn't.
okay, I'm going to be gone in a few months, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes I was kind of lonely. It wasn't that I didn't make friends. I was always friendly
Yeah.
if somebody reached out to me, but I was a little more at the mercy of who decided that they were going to be my friend, which there was always somebody that would be like, oh, the new girl, I'm going to be her friend. But
Yeah.
there's a lot of things, and I look back, and the more I've told my story, the more I actually understand this myself. Um, there's a lot of things that it formed me in positive ways, and it also caused me to have some coping mechanisms that I've had to get over later in
Hmm.
my life. And I also want to touch on something that you talked about earlier with how we aren't taught to, really examine our thoughts and see how it affects us emotionally. You know, a lot of times, I mean, most of the time, we just sort of inherit a lot of habits that other people in our family have, and so when I
Yeah.
think back to, my childhood, my parents were so young. My mother actually turned 17 2 weeks after I was born. So she was
Wow.
so super young.
Really
She
young.
she had to drop out of high school after 10th grade to get married. Which is so crazy. Um, but she wasn't even, really a mature adult. And so
She's
both of
still a
my parents,
child from a
yeah, she
brain
was
health
really,
perspective.
that's right. And she didn't have the benefit of perspective and learning, that comes with more mature parenthood. And so as a child, I probably didn't have the best role models to, they
Mm.
didn't understand some of these things themselves. And so they weren't really, modeling behavior, that I know my mother especially was a bit of a victim of her own emotional state, was often sort of
Yeah.
on an emotional roller coaster. So
And she would have been at just,
yeah,
irrespective of falling pregnant, that's when,
right.
as a kid, we're on a huge emotional roller coaster because that's when our emotional parts of our brain are highly active through that puberty period. When we're developing, especially around the sort of, 15 to 18
Hmm.
era, where we're driven
Yeah.
by the need for connection, that overriding emotional need to connect with peers,
Hmm.
um, and the the unstable emotions and with all the hormones and everything else, which
Yeah,
she would have
right.
had even amplified
And
for
then she
becoming a
was
parent.
disconnected, because
Yeah.
she was so young. And my parents bought a trailer, so whenever um it was time to move on to the next town, and it wasn't just always the next town, sometimes it might be a couple states away,
Hmm.
so um the like distance of the area that we moved, it was from, you know I think like Indiana all the way to Florida and a lot of the states in between. So it's a
Wow.
huge geographic area. It wasn't like, oh, let's go to the next town over and the next town over where you
It
might
wasn't
be able
like a
to
1 hour, 2 hour,
visit.
4 hour drive. It
No,
was
no.
days.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Um, so anyway, I had to figure out a lot of things for myself. Let's just put it that
Yeah.
way. And a lot of times I kind of felt like my mother and I were kind of growing up together,
Right.
even when I was a teenager, sometimes I kind of felt like I was a little bit older than she was.
Yeah.
But shifting to a time when I kind of had to face up to my own issues around, mental health and so forth. I was married. I was working full time as a marketing manager for a large bank. I had one child, and becoming a parent to that one child was pretty seamless. I was, my husband and I were totally in love with him, and just
Hmm.
everything was so great. And in fact, we, loved being parents so much that my husband kept saying, "When are we having another one? When are we having another one?" So we ended up having our second son. Um, about I'm trying to think. My oldest son was a year and 9 months old. So, basically
Wow.
I got pregnant when he was a year
That's really
old with,
close.
yeah, it is. And I think that I was a little bit naive because I was like, "Oh, my child is an angel and look at he's like such a good boy." And of course by the time my second was born, my oldest was like close to the terrible twos, right? And it's
Yeah.
it's all natural, right? But he wasn't like that docile, he was still a sweet boy, but he wasn't docile. He was going running around doing crazy things, and so I can remember being home for maternity leave, and I think I had a little bit of postpartum depression, number
Uh-huh.
one. And I did take like 3 months off for a maternity leave, but having a very active toddler and having my second son, who actually he was kind of colicky. He was very
Hmm.
hard to comfort. He cried a lot. He didn't go to sleep, and so he was a little bit more difficult to parent than my first one had been. So like dealing with, you know, trying to keep my 2-year old from doing crazy things while I was trying to nurse my baby, I was exhausted, and
Mm.
I have always been pretty. I mean, I've learned to soften this a bit, but always had very, very high expectations for myself. So, when I was looking around my house and my house wasn't clean and the laundry was piling up while my husband was at work, I like my internal dialogue was just very, very harsh and negative, like a lot of shoulds, like, oh, you should be able to do all of this and you should be able to keep up the laundry. And my husband was actually very supportive. He'd just be like,
Mm.
look, your job is to keep the kids alive, you know? But I just really was, mentally grinding on myself by telling myself like I had to be perfect in every way. And I got to a point where I just was so angry and I really was starting to kind of like dip into depression. I finally got some help, from a
Mm.
therapist, and I kind of woke up to the fact that if I didn't learn how to bend, that I was going to break,
Yeah,
and
that's
so
a
I
great
did.
analogy.
Yeah, because really was so rigid in my beliefs about what I quote unquote should be doing.
Mm.
And,
And was
you
that
know,
internal beliefs that you had manifested yourself, or was it in beliefs that had been kind of imposed on you by the outside world and, in society's expectations? Because as parents, especially, in the sort of 60s and 70s, and and early 80s, I know not quite the same now, but in the past it was, you were expected as a mother to be able to do absolutely everything: clean the house,
hmm
wash the
hmm
washing, put your makeup on, look beautiful, have your kids all dressed in their best, before and I know that this is a very kind of sexist description, but this is what the reality was, wasn't it?
hmm
And then be able to show up your best for your husband when they came home, whenever that would be, and have the dinner on.
Yeah, yeah.
And
Um, I don't know if I think it was really more my own um my own pressure that I was putting on myself. Now, my mother was she's pretty much a perfectionist. And so I suppose I was taking cues from that.
Uh-huh.
But I always had been able to keep all the plates spinning before
All
this.
spinning, yeah.
I went to, you know, elite college, and then I got an MBA, and I, was always moving up in my career. And then I had this, first child, and he just fit right into the family. I was able to, again, keep all the plates spinning. But it was with the addition of a second child that, and it's not his fault it's just the reality of a growing family,
It's reality
and
of becoming a super mum, because
yeah,
any person that has more than one child, it's hard enough having one child.
and
When
also
you
it's
add
one thing.
another on top, it's so much more
Well,
complex.
absolutely. And a baby that is not mobile is relatively easy to care for. I mean, they cry a lot, and you have to kind of plan your schedule around their sleep schedule and so forth.
Hmm.
But when there's one child and two parents that are doting on that child, it's not as hard. But when you add a new baby, and then the older child is, becoming more independent. And I mean, I can't even tell you how many times I'd be like chasing my 2-year-old because he would, grab scissors and start running around the house. And I'd be trying to feed his brother. And then I'd be like holding the infant to my breast and running around chasing the other one. It's just like,
And
it
I
was,
know my mum, I was the youngest of three, and
uh-huh.
my mum had two kids. My brother's 4.5 years old, and my sister's 7. And she
Hmm.
couldn't breastfeed me because she said it was so disruptive. They wouldn't give her the
Hmm.
opportunity to breastfeed me
Yeah.
because of the dynamic of the children's situation at home.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it was interesting during that time because I projected my anger onto my husband,
Yeah.
um, because I suppose because I didn't understand that I had control over my thoughts at first. And it was, through going to see a therapist and then just making some very small steps. Like, for example, my husband and I actually started meeting for lunch. Like, when I went back to work, he and I would meet for lunch. We worked at different places, but we would meet for
Yeah.
lunch because we could actually, in some ways have little bit of a date, a lunch date, and have
Yeah.
time alone without, the overwhelming responsibility of these two little crazy boys that we had, and they were very, very active. And it's funny because at that time, or I have three sisters, and so when I got married and we started having children, I always thought I want to have more than two kids. But after having two sons, I had a massive yard sale and got rid of all of the baby stuff because I was like, oh my gosh, there's no way
You're done.
that I can do this. But I will tell you, I do have a third child, but she was born when my second one was 4.5 years old.
Oh,
And
wow.
so,
Okay.
once they were like older and, in school and preschool or regular school and that potty trained and all of that, I was like, I could take a breath. And then we even at that point, it wasn't like we're having another child. We were like, oh, well, let's just see what happens. And so we ended up having a third daughter, and she's like an angel. I mean, she's
Ah.
frustrating sometimes. She's 18 now, but she was a very easy child. So after juggling those two crazy little boys, I was like, oh, okay, good. I get a, little daughter for me, but she's been a joy. Actually, all three of them are joy, but
And did you finish your therapy before you had your third? Did that facilitate you to kind of take back control of your thoughts and then?
yes, absolutely, absolutely. It there were a lot of things I had to accept. I mean, one of the other things that kind of had an impact on that was I was able to lose the baby weight after my first child pretty easily, but
Hmm.
after my second son, it didn't come off as easily, and I was
Possibly because you were stressed and you held on to
absolutely
it.
probably wasn't getting enough sleep. I might have
Yeah.
had a little hormonal imbalance, which I'm a little upset with the doctors because I can remember going in and telling them that I was feeling sort of listless, and they just were like, oh, well, you're new, new mom, and, of course you're going to be tired. And I wish that they would take that more seriously. I think now they finally are, but I think that was part of it. I did learn my lesson. And by the time that during that time, I was really, again, judgmental of myself, as if I didn't have enough going on
Hmm.
for me to shame myself about not losing weight. And in fact, I wasn't buying new clothes that fit me, and so I didn't feel that good when I was going to work. My pants were just a little tight. And because I was like, oh, you don't just lose the weight, you can get back into these clothes. But when my daughter was born, a few years later, I just went out and bought some suits that were the right size. They were a couple sizes bigger than my normal size,
Yeah.
but at least whenever I went into work, I felt like I was put together. I felt like I
Yeah.
looked good. And that actually helped, right? Because then
It makes a huge
it
difference. I
makes a
think we
huge
really
difference.
downplay the importance of how we feel physically
Right.
to how it makes us feel emotionally. I know when I was, at my largest, I felt awful in myself. I ended up
Yeah.
losing 27 pounds in weight. But
Hmm.
when you do the mirror test and you look at yourself, whether you've got clothes on or not, and you don't feel like you're the you,
Hmm.
it really has a big impact on you psychologically.
It really does. And I think that we really need to treat ourselves as our best friends. I think there's way too many times when our internal dialogue is actually very harsh and very cruel, and we would
Yeah.
never speak to another human being the way that we will speak to ourselves inside,
Yeah.
call ourselves names, criticize the smallest little thing, when in fact we'd probably never do that to anyone else. And I
Yeah,
really,
we would never have that conversation with our best friend.
no, no, not like, oh, that was an idiot move, or, you're fat, and you're, whatever. Like, these were things that I thought back then, oh, you should be able to do this and that. And, you're not worthy if you're not keeping your house clean, or, like, your house looks like a sty because you have laundry everywhere. Come on.
Yeah.
That's,
And
I
we
had
compare
enough going
ourselves
on.
in Yeah, and we compare ourselves in so many different ways, don't we? We compare ourselves physically, in terms of how we
Mhm.
look. We compare ourselves emotionally in terms of how we're feeling and the feelings that we're having. And if we're having emotional wobbles, we say you need to pull yourself together. You shouldn't be feeling
Mhm.
like this. We
Right.
compare ourselves mentally. If we've got brain fog, it's like,
Yeah.
we compare how we can perform mentally. And then we compare ourselves spiritually as to whether we are showing up and doing what we think we ought to be able to doing, and being the best version
Yeah.
of ourselves in the role that we place ourselves in,
Yeah.
like being a parent or being a mother and new mum. you
Mhm.
feel you feel you have to be a super mum, and have
Yeah.
everything all dialed in, and the reality is that's just not the case.
Right. I absolutely, I completely agree with that. And when I think back, I don't think I gave myself enough credit for the miracle that I had performed in giving birth to two healthy children. Um,
Yeah.
that's miraculous, and my body did that. But yet I was treating it as if I should still be able to just bounce back to what I was like when I was 25 years old, right? But that was a pre-pregnancy body, right? That's, once you've gone through these transformations, you've just evolved to something different, right? And I think that, and unfortunately, I think somewhat our society gives us as women messages that aren't the healthiest. But we as
Mm.
women and as mothers can also um, support ourselves to say, like, I'm not going to buy into that, right? We can be selective about the external judgments and beliefs that we allow or that we embrace, right? And if we will just say to ourselves, like, hey, my body has performed a freaking miracle, you know and I'm gonna focus on that rather than the fact that I can't get into the same size jeans that I did 5 years ago.
Yeah, I love that. And I know you mentioned you went on therapy. Now, I'd love to touch on this a
Hmm.
little bit, because some people, you know, when we learn about our thoughts and about taking back control of our thoughts and knowing what the automatic negative thoughts are, and we can have up to 90,000 thoughts in a single day, and many of them are not very positive, and an awful lot of them we don't need to say out loud. How long did it take you to really take back control and learn the techniques with regards to understanding your self-talk and being able to control it?
You know, it's hard for me to remember at this point, but, you know, I think I was probably going to that therapist for about a year. And it was just very helpful to have, in some ways, like, you know, a backstop, you know, somebody to help me put things in the proper perspective. You know, so if I was saying things out loud that I was thinking, that she could kind of mirror it back to me, and then I could understand, because I say this all the time, that you can't read the label from inside the bottle. You know, we are walking around, isn't it? It's like so apt, because we're just walking around being who we are. We're not thinking about, like, what do I look like? How am I showing up? And when you work with a therapist or a coach, you know, they're holding a mirror up for you so that
Exactly.
you can start to see yourself in context and be like, oh, like just what I said earlier. You know, I was not thinking about the fact that my body had performed this miracle that many people will pay, you know, tens and even hundreds of thousands of dollars if they're having trouble with fertility. They will pay a lot of money to have what I had happen fairly easily.
Yeah.
And, you know, I need to give myself credit for that, right? I mean, not being critical in any way if somebody has fertility problems, but, you know, we all have things that come easy, and things that are harder. And just to understand it all in the context, not look at the things that are hard and criticize ourselves for it, but like be grateful for the things that come easy, so that you have the energy to address the things that are a little more difficult, you know,
And
because
you know,
we all have our issues.
yeah, we do. And you know, from a, you know, becoming a mum perspective, it takes us 9 months to make a baby.
Right.
It takes us 9 months to make a baby. That's near, you know, that's 3/4 of the year. And we don't, you know, it takes us that long to make one. It takes a lifetime to nurture one. But we think that we're going to bounce back in like 2, 3, 4 weeks, and be able to perform everything like this instantly, with all of our hormonal levels, you know, crashing back down into a new norm.
And then sleep
you know, our brain,
deprivation.
Exactly, and our brain changes. So talking about, you know, sleep deprivation, women who have babies, their brain changes, so they go into a deep sleep much quicker post giving birth, so that they have the ability to recover and perform better with sleep deprivation than men can. That's why it's hard. It's easier generally for women to get up in the night than it is for men, and they feel much groggier, because we've biologically evolved to deal with the sleep deprivation.
It makes sense.
And it's still hard. It's still hard.
It is hard. I will say, though, that my husband was so kind. Like, he would get up and get my child and bring it to me to feed in the middle of the night. So, you know, I still had to wake up to feed him, but I didn't have to get up. He would do that, which is sweet. And I encourage any of your listeners who are dads to do that for their wives, because it was a huge gift. You know, I mean, he can get back to sleep pretty easily too. So, you know, he'd get up for 2 minutes and then be back snoring away next to me and the baby.
And it's so important to have that kind of dynamic, isn't it, to help you through those
it was very helpful
stages. But I really, you know, the fact that you took a year of therapy, it's just really testament to the fact that we don't learn how to manage our thoughts overnight. This is not an overnight process. It's not like pick up a manual or read a book and instantly you've got all the results. It's like picking up a book on how to become a parent.
Yeah,
and
and
expecting that to
that's a
just work, because it
that's
doesn't
a
work that
really
way. We have to learn it, we have to practice
right.
it, we have to, understand it, and it really takes time to learn how we can control ourselves.
That's a very apt analogy about the parenting because, obviously parenting a baby is different from parenting a toddler is different than parenting a tween. And, you know, you have to constantly be showing up to face whatever challenge is in front of you. And, when we were talking about therapy, I mean, I feel like therapy is like peeling an onion.
Yeah,
I've typically, gone to therapy for a while, and then I feel like, okay, I've reached a place where I'm comfortable or I've addressed whatever the issue was. And then maybe a couple years later, I'm facing new challenges and I'll go back, and because I've incorporated everything that I learned into myself, but then maybe I'm meeting a new challenge. And so I go and get some help with that. And it's
and
really
that's
great.
okay. And
Yeah,
I think
I mean, I think it's the smart thing to do, right? Because
exactly. I really agree, because therapy is not about because you're failing, it's because you want to be successful.
right,
It's you
yeah,
reach a bump in the road and you want somebody to lift you over it or navigate you around it in a way that
yes,
you don't know how to, and that's okay. That's okay.
yeah. I ended up, there's somebody that I work with periodically now, and she's a therapist, but she also is a Reiki practitioner.
Oh,
And
okay.
I had gone to therapy for a while, and I mean, maybe some people can relate to this, that sometimes you have challenges that it's hard to get over and get past. And I can remember talking to one therapist and saying, "How long am I going to talk about this?" Because I just felt I got tired of hearing myself talk about the same topic. And she said, "Well, you're going to talk about it as long as you need to." And then somebody said to me, "Have you ever considered having energy work done?" And I was like, "What's energy
Yeah.
work?" But when we sort of like block our emotions, when we don't allow that energy to flow. Like I've heard people talk about emotions as energy and motion. And a lot
Yeah.
of times we'll like bottle it up, right? We like you were talking earlier about like, oh, we're going to watch TV or we're going to overeat or drink or party or whatever, or work, workaholic. So I don't have to face the sadness or the anger or whatever. But that energy does not leave your body. And in
It
fact,
doesn't go. It goes into your body,
it goes
actually.
into your body. And, the beauty of working with Stephanie is my therapist's name, working with her is that we would do regular therapy. And then she has a massage table in her office, and we'd do an hour of therapy and then 30 minutes of Reiki, where she'd say, well, where do you feel that this energy is stuck in your
Yeah.
body? I don't know how to explain Reiki, but I'm a little bit of a skeptical person, and I just remember the first time that she did it, she kind of put her hands above my head on the table, and the amount of heat that went through my body and like kind of connected with her hands was
Wow.
kind of otherworldly. But I really credit her with helping me like discover and process a lot of like, I don't know, lumps of molten
Energy.
energy, yeah, that were just stuck. And
Yeah.
when it takes energy to keep the lid on, you know, energy that's or emotion that's not processed, and so
Yeah,
it
it
really
does.
keeps you from having more energy to do things that are fun and or just
Yeah.
even step up and live your life. And it's
And it can make you
as
sick as well. Really
oh my
sick.
gosh. Well, even after going through the Reiki, she would say to me like, okay, I want you to go home and take it easy, like maybe take an Epsom salt bath because you basically have had psychic surgery. And I did have some times where, I mean, this might even sound unbelievable, but I had times where I would come home from a session and I would have to stay in bed for the rest of the day because I was just so exhausted
Yeah.
because my body was like giving up something that it had trapped within it. I mean, I don't even know how to explain it, but you know, people that I've seen, friends that I've known for a long time that I hadn't seen for a while after I'd gone through, working with Stephanie, because I've worked with her for about 5 years now. Um, they'd be like, you just seem happier. And honestly, it's because I was expending a lot of energy on keeping the lid on,
Hmm.
some of the trauma, some of the, negative beliefs that I had about myself that came from just how I was raised.
Mm.
And again, I'm not, I mean, I think that my parents just didn't know any better than to just operate the way they operated, right? And so
Yeah,
I'm
and they were
learning
had a really
things.
difficult time too, didn't they? Given
Yeah.
their age and
Yeah.
the
And
need to
even
make
before
money
that,
and
yeah, even before that, I mean, if you look back over the generations, or I mean, I'll just speak for myself. I look back over the generations. It's like, okay, my grandparents, they came up through the Depression, and
mm,
both of my maternal grandparents were in the army during World War II. So they lived through difficult times, and that informed how they operated in their lives and
mm,
how they raised their children. And then that impacts how, my parents raised us. So,
mm,
it's if we can kind of step back from it and just realize like everybody does the best they can, but it really is up to us to decide how we want to experience life. And
mm,
we do
mm,
have, it's not easy, but we can have more control over how we experience life if we're willing to take responsibility for the beliefs. And, sometimes I think it can be a real eye opener for people to step away from their patterns, right? Like I've worked with people who, any feedback that they get from a coworker, from a boss, they take as like, bitter criticism.
puts them in a
Be,
flat spin.
yeah, yeah, exactly. When, it's actually their choice about how they take that, and
Mm,
I wrote about this in my book, that it's very interesting to start to realize that, it's your perception is your reality. And, people will say, no, no, this is exactly how it is. That person's being critical. They don't like me, whatever. These are things that you're telling yourself, because we never know what other people think of us. But, if we think that that person thinks that, that's really what's causing us pain. It's not because we don't know what somebody else thinks, and we can
no, exactly,
choose.
unless we actually ask them.
And even if we ask them, they might not tell you the truth. They might not even
No.
have access to the truth. But I like to use an example, and I've thought about this with my husband and I. He's a pretty easygoing kind of person, and we've definitely been in places like we've been in the store or a restaurant or something, and something happens in front of us, and I might be like, oh my gosh, can you see, that's horrible. Did you see what just happened? And he'll be like, what's the big deal? And it's really just because we have different belief systems, right? We have different
Yeah,
beliefs about what quote unquote should happen.
yeah,
But if our reactions to things are causing us pain, we can step back and say, what's the belief that's causing me to have this reaction? And if we can pull that to the surface, we can ask ourselves, how's this serving me? Is this serving me
yeah,
well? And if it's not, what can I choose to replace it with?
yeah. I'd love to
You know?
dive into that in the context of the 5 pillars of brain health, but just from a
Yeah,
little bit of a fun facts perspective.
yeah.
So the 5 pillars is feelings, our actions, our connections, our thoughts, and our surroundings. So facts.
Hmm.
So we say, let's look at the facts. So the
Hmm.
first one is feelings. What's the funniest or most embarrassing thing that's ever happened to you?
Oh my gosh. Um, well, I will tell you like a humiliating thing that happened to me, which actually was a huge pivot point in my career, was
Okay.
um, I was the right-hand person of the head of marketing for a division of the bank where I worked. And, I worked very, very closely with him. I like wrote most of the communications for the department. I was sort of his, conversation partner to developing strategy and so forth. But he was the face of the department. He left the company, and I said to myself, I'd worked there for 8 or 9 years, and I thought, you know what? I think I'm ready to step up into that role. So I applied for the job, um, went through the first round of interviews with HR fine,
Mhm.
but the second round of interviews were in a different city with a panel of other marketers. And I mean, there were hundreds of marketers in the greater department. It's a very huge company. And I knew these people, but I didn't know them on a day-to-day basis. I knew them like, oh, when we have the big like marketing offsites, I'd see them. But I didn't do anything to prepare. I just thought, oh, they know me and they like me.
So you didn't
And I went,
connect with them and learn about them or anything like
I,
that?
yeah, and I also didn't really. I hadn't interviewed in like 9 years, and so I didn't do anything to prepare. And I went
Hmm.
in feeling like I was the heir apparent, and I totally bombed in the interview. And I felt
Oh,
so humiliated. Um, and I was eliminated from the process. But I came back and I said to myself, I don't ever want to feel like that again. So what do I need to do? And so I actually hired an executive coach, and this was back in the early 2000s. And I remember like sort of scratching my head and being like, I mean, coaching wasn't as big of a thing back then, but saying to myself, I think there's something called like a career coach or an executive coach. I wonder if I can find one. It was even before Google. So I was like going on Yahoo and I found
yeah.
somebody that I worked with. Um, and weirdly enough, they offered the job to somebody and she turned it down, and they uh, started the process all over again. And after having worked with the coach for a few months, I reapplied for the job. I was a finalist. It was me and an external candidate. And I'm a two-time loser because I did not get the job offer. But as fate would have it, the day I found out that the other candidate accepted the job, I came back from lunch and there was a call on my phone, a voicemail from a recruiter. And within like 3 or 4 months, I had two job offers. I was actively interviewing for a third, and I ended up taking one of the jobs that moved me here to Chicago. And
Wow.
it was I think it was a better job than the one I didn't get. So sometimes
Yay! Everything
if you
happens for a reason.
yeah, exactly. And I think, just being willing to keep moving forward and not kind of get stuck in saying, well, okay, like I really easily could have, after not advancing after that first round of interviews, I could have said, oh, well, I guess I'm just stuck at this level. I'll never, but I was like, no, I don't want to believe that. I want to believe that I have more to offer, but I just have some things I need to work on. And just
Yeah.
me doing that work, it didn't happen there, but believe me, where I live now, it's
Yeah.
much better. I live like outside of Chicago, and this was I lived in North Carolina at the time, which I lived in a lovely community, but there's just so much more going on here. And
Yeah. Yeah. And it's so important that we do give ourselves permission to ask for help, whether it's a
yeah,
coach or a therapist. And I myself, when I was going through a pivot moment, got an executive coach as well. And I was just thinking to myself, my goodness, why didn't I ask for this sooner? I could have done
yeah.
this ages ago. And,
I was really
propelled myself so much faster.
yes, yes.
But I
I was
didn't.
really I was hung up on the money, like and it's so
Yeah.
funny because like what I was paying in this, smaller North Carolina city is just really a fraction of what I charge now. But, you can sometimes like look at the price tag and say, oh my gosh, that's a lot. But the return on the investment is what, and I mean, the return on the investment that I made is like, thousands of percent above what I invested. But I
Yeah.
had to believe in myself enough to say, I'm worthy of this investment.
And
And
this comes back to a really important point there is I'm worthy of that
yes,
worth. So it's
yes,
valuing your own worth. It's not about the money, it's about how you
yeah,
value yourself from a worth perspective. And
yes.
you tag that money value onto yourself and it's like I'm not worth investing in that
It goes
amount of money.
Yeah, it goes back to something that I mentioned earlier that, for high achievers, a lot of times they're looking for that validation from other people,
Mm,
and so I could have easily in that situation. I mean, listen, I bumbled along in that, I was driven and I didn't want to just sit there and feel like a loser because, I was rejected for a job that I was kind of the heir apparent for. But I take responsibility for the fact that I did not mentally promote myself to that level and show up like the leader that they were looking to hire. But by working with somebody, I was able to do that. But we have to at some point, shift that judgment or that validation responsibility to ourselves. Like I mean, it didn't feel good that other people weren't validating me, but I was holding on to my own belief that I was worthy of continuing to move up in my career, and believing that I was smart enough and capable enough of doing that next level job. And so, if you can hold on to that, and then the focus becomes, okay, well, how do I build that bridge to the other side? Or how do I make the impression on others that I'm capable of doing this? Because it's not a
Mm,
matter of whether other people think you are worthy. It's really a matter of you demonstrating that you can bring the value if they entrust you with that
mm,
role.
mm,
It's a little bit of a different challenge than, am I worthy? Yeah, you're
mm.
worthy. Yes, of course you're worthy, right? And it's up to you what you decide to do with that.
Yeah, yeah. I'd love to dive into into one of the other pillars, which is thoughts, because I know we've talked a lot about this
Hmm.
in this show. Is what stupid or crazy thought have you often told yourself in the past that isn't true?
Oh my gosh. Um, well, I mean, it's the one that I think most people struggle with, and that is that I'm not good enough.
I'm
I
not
think
enough.
that that's
Hmm.
always been what's driven my um, perfectionism. And
Hmm.
I'm definitely a recovering perfectionist. And there's certain things that I'm proud of. I'm proud of being detail oriented. I'm proud of being able to look at situations and discern, like, what could this be. um, but I think that holding on to perfectionism sometimes keeps me frozen, because I'm
Mm,
afraid, like, oh, if I can't move forward and do this perfectly, it's gonna hurt if I make a mistake, or it's going to, um, I'm gonna look foolish. Which, it's funny because I have so many friends and colleagues that if I ever will say to them, you know, I don't feel good enough, they're like, "Oh my gosh, you don't come off that way. You come off very, very confident." And um, there's just always that little part, right? And I think that it's just important to be kind to that part,
absolutely.
and not
Absolutely.
kind of chastise yourself and say, because I think in the past I would be very harsh with that part of me, and
Yeah, yeah. Well,
really, yeah,
yeah, and this show's all about brain health and unchaining your pain, and I'd love to dive into that. Is what one piece of advice would you give anyone who's kind of winning the game at work, but they're kind of got to a plateau and they've got this perfectionist
hmm,
mentality, and maybe they've
yeah,
not got into the recovering perfectionist space? What one
yeah.
piece of advice would you give to somebody who's at that place?
Well, what got you here is not going to get you there. Okay. Like, it's natural as we grow and as we advance at work that we're going to hit new plateaus. And it's, it's important to recognize that we all have blinders on in our lives.
Mm,
And yeah, I mean, we kind of have to, because otherwise, like, everything going on around us would just overwhelm us. We wouldn't be able to focus. But we also have to recognize that maybe the part that we're seeing isn't the whole picture, right? And
mm,
so if you've gotten to a point and you're trying a lot of things and you're not getting the outcomes that you'd like, maybe you're not trying some things that would actually be effective. And you know, this is when it's helpful to get somebody involved to help you, whether it's a therapist, whether it's a mentor, whether it's a coach, because they can help you sort of start to expand those, or pull back the blinders a little bit to start to see, like, oh wow, I didn't realize I had other ways of showing up, or that if I did something different I might get a different outcome. And I just
mm.
see a lot of people, I mean, myself sometimes as well, but I see it a lot with my high achieving clients, is that they'll say, well, this always worked for me in the past. And I'm like, well, you're in a new situation now. And so if you're in a new situation, you may need to show up differently to get different results. And this is
Mm,
particularly relevant as you move up, levels. And I kind of mentioned that I did not mentally promote myself. I was a very effective worker bee, right? But when you become a department head, it's a different role. You've got to represent, you've got to direct. It's not about how good somebody is as an individual contributor. It's about how can you leverage the talents of people under you. It's a different skill set. And
Mm.
I've seen it so often where people will be promoted and they keep doing their old job. And in fact, like a
It's
lot of
like having
times,
your operating system, isn't it? Where you're going to do into a new role, so you need to get a new app or a new
yeah,
piece of software to deliver that role effectively.
yeah,
But in order to deliver it effectively, you also have to fix the software issues that you might have, the
yeah,
bugs in your system that are
right?
preventing you from running that new software effectively and your existing software
Yeah,
effectively
it's like you're
to be
not
able
getting
to
the
deliver.
updates. You're not getting the updates, right? Like you've got that you need to get the software, but it only runs on the next level update, but you're trying to run it on the old operating system and it's
Exactly.
glitching. It's glitching. I've seen a lot of times people, as managers, one of the things that's important as a manager is to start to think about how do I teach the things that I know to the people on my team so that I can elevate myself to what's required at my level and I can delegate the things that used to be my job that aren't anymore. But I've seen it so often where I hear it all the time from my clients like it's just faster for me to do it. And I'm like, no. If you're doing something that somebody else on your team is capable of doing, even if it takes them longer, you are not doing something that only you can do.
Yeah.
And that means that you're kind of like dipping down to the level below you to do that level of work rather than staying up at the higher level. And I can understand why people sometimes do that because it's comforting to be a master of something. Oh, I can do the spreadsheet really
Or they're a
quickly.
perfectionist and they
Yeah,
can't
right. And I
accept
mean,
anything less.
I've learned, and this didn't come, simply or easily, but one of the things that I learned was that when I would be clear about, delegating something and not telling the person on my team how to do it, but what the objective was, that
Yeah.
a lot of times they would come up with a way better, faster, cooler way of doing something than I did it, right? Just because they're a different person, they've got a different perspective. And you've got to, people like working for managers that allow them to have that kind of freedom and have
Exactly.
enough trust and belief in them to deliver at their highest.
And they perform better because
Yeah,
they're not
sure.
constantly being assessed and being put down because they can't leverage their own internal superpower because
Right,
it's not exactly the same as the manager and nobody's the same. So we
right,
need to
right.
leverage the attributes that we all bring together and get the best out of the system.
Yes, definitely. And if I said that a lot of times leaders will say, "Oh, it's just faster for me to do it." Probably the number one complaint of people who, if they have a complaint about their boss, it's that their boss is a micromanager.
Yeah.
Because, and I look at it like if somebody is micromanaging, you are sending a lot of kind of clear messages to the people below you that they're not good enough, that
Yeah.
you don't trust them.
And they'll stop performing. They've done scientific studies where actually micromanagers, it doesn't matter how excellent your team are, the team will default to a lesser level of
Sure,
performance based on
they
your
will
leadership style. So
they
it's
will
really vital to get the best out of your team is to give them permission to be them.
yeah, they just comply at the lowest required level. And
Yeah.
the interesting thing is that a lot of times as the person on the team kind of shrinks back, they're like, okay, you want it done this way. I could do it better, but whatever. Or you want it done this way, this perfect way in your mind. That they're just delivering at the minimum, but because they're not giving more, a lot of times the leader will micromanage even more and even more, and really they need to kind of step out. I always say I use this whole idea of zooming in and zooming out. A lot of times when things aren't going the way that people want them to, they zoom in. Oh, I've got to do more, I've got to go faster, I've got to take on extra projects. And in reality, they need to zoom out and see the big picture, see the
Yeah.
dynamics of the situation that they're in, whether it's, them personally as an individual contributor, or as a leader to understand, like, why are people doing this?
It's the same as
Oh,
parenting though, isn't it? Because
yeah,
like as a parent, you can't teach your child to walk and do it for them. You have to
right.
give them permission to learn how to do it themselves. And yes, it might take them a bit longer, but ultimately, unless you allow that to happen, they're never going to get there. And it's the same, with any skill set as your child is learning the process, but
Hmm.
eventually they become independent. But if you don't give them an opportunity to flourish and bring different ideas and you know uh, different insights into the situation that you'd
Hmm.
never have even thought of, and my daughter always comes up with amazing comments and quotes,
Right.
is
Yeah.
is you don't get that richer picture, you don't get that experience that you would otherwise have, allowing people to just be them.
Exactly. And I think that, whether you're talking about a family or you're talking about a team, that if every person feels safe to bring their best, overall, you're going to have a higher level of performance. You're going to have a higher level of engagement and satisfaction if people feel like I can be myself and I can bring
Yeah.
my strengths to the table without feeling like I'm going to be criticized or that
Judged.
something's going to be taken away from me and I'm going to be told I have to do it this other way that
Yeah.
you know
That's so important. Terry, it's been amazing talking to you. I know, we could talk for hours. I think we should come back on the show. Such an interesting topic. How can people get hold of you?
Well, they can go to my website, terrybmcdougall.com, and they can set up a free exploratory call if they want to learn more. I'm also active on LinkedIn, and my handle there is Terry B. McDougall. If you're interested in the topic of marketing or just, conversations with cool people, my podcast is Marketing Mambo, and it's at marketingmambo.net or on any of the platforms. And then finally, if you want to win at work, check out my book, Winning the Game of Work, on Amazon worldwide.
Yeah, I love that. And I love your book, and it's so relatable for me. So do make sure you get that. Terry, it's been absolutely brilliant. I've loved our conversation. We've gone so many different places. And if there's anything I can do to support you and the clients you serve, then please, do just reach out, and I'm sure we'll be connecting again very, very soon.
That sounds great, Dr. Ruth. It was so fun talking with you today. Thanks for having me.
You're most welcome. And just remember, everyone, this show is all about brain health and unchaining your pain. You're not stuck with the brain you have. As Terry's mentioned, you have the power to make it better. And we're here to show you how. Now, there is a message from our sponsors.
By WINJECT Studios. We are an all-in-one educational platform for podcasters that revolutionizes how hosts leverage content to increase engagement with listeners, downloads, and income. We come together to focus on community, collaboration, and collective impact. For more information on how you can interact directly with our hosts, access exclusive live content with offers you can't get anywhere else from our official partners, join our purpose-driven community by visiting www.winject.com. If you're ready to build a career doing what you love, then we're ready to see you there.